and gentlemen, it's with great pleasure that we welcome our guest speaker at the Flodden Field Service this year, the Earl of Arundel and Surrey. He confessed to me some time ago that he thought he might be a little bit apprehensive today, on two accounts. One, because he was grossly outnumbered, and two, because his father was going to be sitting there listening to every word. But I assure you, sir, that you're among friends. Born on 2nd December 1956, he was educated at Ampleforth College in York and Lincoln College, Oxford, where he graduated with an honours degree in philosophy and economics. On leaving college, he spent 1 year as a trainee accountant before setting up a gas distribution company based in East London. He and his partner sold the business and are now involved in landfill in Sheffield. However, most of our speaker's time is spent running the family estate and business interests. He has also been a non-executive director of Sotheby's since 1988. Our speaker's family tree can be traced back through the Howard family, the Duke of Norfolk, to Edward I, King of England, 1272, and through the Fitzalan family, Earl of Arundel, to Roger de Montgomery in 1067. A descendant of the Earl of Surrey, who was the brilliant military commander who at the age of 70 years commanded the English army at the Battle of Flodden in 1513. After his victory over the Scottish army, was awarded with the restoration of the Dukedom of Norfolk. We welcome you here today, sir, and we look forward with great interest to your oration. Ladies and gentlemen, Lord Arundel.
I think you will all agree that for the current Earl of Surrey to come to Flodden Field to talk to 300 Scotsmen about the battle is a brave act indeed. Whereas my ancestor was outnumbered 3-2, I fear today that it's more like 4-1, and so I've brought my car with me just in case I need to make a hasty retreat. I must also tell you all at the outset that, strictly speaking, I am not the current Earl of Surrey. Instead, my father is, as he holds this title with several others, in addition to being the Duke of Norfolk. But for centuries in my family, the eldest son has been allowed to call himself the Earl of Surrey as a courtesy title. So if my father disagrees with anything I say here today, don't be at all surprised if he takes over the proceedings and puts me humbly in my place. Thomas Howard, the Earl of Surrey, who commanded the English army at Flodden in 1513, was, however, Earl of Surrey in his own right. He had been created this in 1483 by Richard III, at the same time as his father was made Duke of Norfolk. This was a glorious period for my family, who through a string of political successes, good marriages, proximity to the king's person, and above all, a great deal of luck, had achieved a meteoric rise in the late Middle Ages to the head of the English nobility. The trouble was that this power was short-lived, because 2 years later, in 1485, at the Battle of Bosworth, we found ourselves on the losing side when Henry VII defeated and killed Richard III. Norfolk was killed in the battle, and Surrey therefore succeeded to the dukedom, but only for a matter of weeks before he was attainted by Henry VII and lost his title and was imprisoned in the Tower of London, and all his estates and possessions were confiscated from him. This dramatic reversal of fortune for my family, after 2 centuries of steady acquisition, could so easily have been the end of us there and then. We survived due to the shrewd way in which Surrey handled his situation, and the fact that he was of special importance to the Tudors as the best military leader in the country. His position was that he was a man of principle, whose loyalty was always to his king, whoever that might be. He had loyally served, in turn, both Edward IV and Richard III, and now that Henry VII was on the throne, he found no difficulty in swearing his allegiance to him instead. He was perfectly genuine in this explanation of his behaviour, and this was consistent with his actions at Bosworth, where he and his father had remained loyal to Richard III to the end, unlike many other families, such as the Stanleys and the Northumberlands, who switched sides at the last moment once they saw which way the battle was going. After 4 years, he was released from the Tower in 1489. The attainder dropped, and the earldom of Surrey and some of his estates were given back to him. However, at this stage, Henry VII carefully kept back the bulk of his estates and the dukedom of Norfolk, as Surrey was expected to prove his new loyalty to the king first. This he set about doing with great determination. He was made the Lieutenant of Northern England for 10 years, living at Sheriff Hutton, and in 1497 he led a successful military expedition into Scotland, destroying Ayton Castle, which put a temporary end to the numerous raids from north of the border and led to the Anglo-Scottish truce of that year. In 1500, he returned south to court, and a year later, in 1501, he was appointed Lord Treasurer of England, a post which he held for 21 years. He was now head of the Exchequer and one of the 3 chief officers of the Crown, alongside the Lord Chancellor and the Lord Privy Seal. Interestingly, in 1502, he was chosen to accompany Henry VII's daughter, Margaret Tudor, to Edinburgh, when she was given away in marriage to James IV of Scotland. James overlooked the Ayton raid of 5 years earlier and made a great fuss of Surrey, giving him numerous presents. How different things were going to turn out 11 years later at Flodden. On his deathbed in 1509, Henry VII finally restored all of Surrey's ancestral estates to him, in recognition of his loyal service. He had not only survived, he had triumphed. And he was even created Earl Marshal for the coronation of Henry VIII, a post which is still held by my father today. The one thing that had eluded him was the dukedom of Norfolk, but even in this he was to succeed, strangely, due to the great problems caused to my family by the rise of a certain priest called Thomas Wolsey. Henry VIII, as a young man, was bored with the tedium of government, and Wolsey, an energetic and cunning man, advocated a continental war with France, which captivated the mind of the young king. Surrey was against this over-expensive and grandiose scheme. Wolsey further managed to outmaneuver my family in court, so that when Henry VIII finally sailed for France in August 1513, the Howards were left behind to guard the kingdom. This was a setback not only to Surrey, who was by now 69 years old, or at least the English version is he was 69, obviously the Scottish is that he was 70, but also to his eldest son, Thomas Howard, who was Lord Admiral and a notable military commander in his own right. Almost as soon as Henry VIII and the army had left, James IV invaded England. He was drawn into this, having taken the unfortunate step a year earlier of renewing the old alliance with Louis XII of France, promising mutual support should either be attacked by England. Exactly why he did this is unclear, and James's invasion of England was a rash gamble which put at risk the stability and prosperity of his kingdom. He was in so many ways a great king who had established law and order, which was no mean feat, and improved the Scottish economy enormously. He even introduced Renaissance civilization to Scotland. But his lack of judgment was to cost Scotland dearly. Surrey was in London, carrying out his duties as Lord Treasurer, when he first heard of the Scottish threat on the 22nd of July. He immediately left for the north, reaching Pontefract Castle on the 1st of August, and spent the rest of the month assembling and preparing an army of 20,000 men with characteristic speed and efficiency. His many years of service in the north greatly assisted him in this task. By the 3rd of September, he had reached Alnwick Castle, where he is joined by his eldest son, Thomas Howard, the Lord Admiral, together with 5,000 seasoned troops from the French campaign. Together they marched north to meet the Scottish army, reaching Wooler on the 7th of September. There Surrey found that James IV and his troops had taken up a strong position on Flodden Hill, described in a contemporary chronicle as a ground more like a camp or fortress than any meet ground to give battle on. As he knew that the Scottish army outnumbered his own, possibly by as much as 2 to 1, Surrey decided not to risk a frontal attack, but instead sent a challenge to James IV, inviting him to join in battle on the flat ground between Flodden and Wooler. James replied to this with an illogical snub. It became not an earl, thus to challenge a king. By taking this position on Flodden Hill, James IV committed a grave error, as he lost the initiative in the battle to the English. If instead he had advanced to meet them, or retired behind the Tweed, things might well have turned out very differently. As it was, Surrey could now march around the Scottish flank and establish a new shorter supply route for his army from Berwick, rather than relying on more distant Newcastle. He would then have the option of either sitting at Berwick and cutting the Scottish supplies until they starved and retreated, or marching into Scotland and devastating the lowlands behind the back of the Scottish army. As it was, Surrey did neither of these things, and the final plan of battle was hatched by his son Thomas Howard, a trait which sometimes continues in my family down to the current day. Surrey broke camp and moved north, pretending to move towards Scotland, and then suddenly swerved westwards, crossing the River Till on the 9th of September, and advanced down on the Scottish army from the north. In this way, he hoped to force the Scottish army to abandon its strong position on Flodden Hill, and by blocking its retreat, he aimed to defeat it in the field, rather than letting it escape intact. This was a bold and courageous decision, and typical of Surrey, with his superior sense of strategy. This manoeuvre was successful, and James, frightened by the English tactic, abandoned his camp, setting fire to the huts in which his soldiers had been quartered, and moved 1.5 miles northwest to where we are now. The weather was appalling, with visibility non-existent, and at one stage the vanguard of the English army, led by the Lord Admiral, advanced too far in front of the main force, and suddenly found themselves almost on top of the Scottish army. Had the Scots attacked at this moment, then victory would have been theirs. But James IV missed the opportunity. This was another example of his inexperience in battle. Finally, at 4 p.m. that afternoon, both armies were assembled, and they faced each other, separated by the small valley which we see down there before us. The battle commenced with an artillery bombardment from both sides, which went the English way, because the Scottish guns were incorrectly sighted, and most of the shots went over the heads of the English army. The Scottish left flank, being Lord Hume's Borderers and Lord Huntly's Highlanders, then descended the hill and engaged Surrey's youngest son, Edmund Howard, who was in control of the English right flank. Initially, the Scots appeared to have the upper hand, but the borderers then dissipated their advantage by looting Edmund Howard's camp and sitting out the rest of the battle. Seeing the apparent success of his left flank, James then rashly ordered his centre columns, under his own and Lord Crawford's command, to descend the hill and engage the main English force under the command of the Lord Admiral in the centre and Surrey on the left flank. The ground in the centre was far steeper than it had been on the left, and at the bottom there was an area of wet bog. The Scottish charge descended in wave after wave, but it ground to a halt, and James's army was largely destroyed by the English artillery and the arrows raining down on them. Those who were not blown to pieces refused to ask for quarter, and were cut to pieces instead. Thereafter, the English victory was a foregone conclusion. The superior quality of the English artillery was a decisive factor in the battle, and helped to make up for the much smaller size of the English army. Interestingly, this was also the first time in history that artillery had been the decisive factor affecting the outcome of a battle. The fighting went on into the twilight, and by the morning, the King of Scotland, an archbishop, a bishop, 2 abbots, and the chief of the Scottish nobility, 11 earls out of a total of 21, and 16 barons out of 29, were dead, and the remnants of the Scottish army were in full flight. Over 10,000 Scots were reputed to have been killed, whereas the English losses were estimated at only 400. And so Surrey, at the age of 69, had won a decisive victory, which had not only saved England in 1513 from Scottish invasion, but ended the Scottish military threat forever. The Scottish nation was left tragically leaderless. She didn't mount a serious military invasion again until the Jacobite rebellions of the 18th century, but they are another story. The new King James V was only a year old in 1513, and in turn was succeeded in 1542 by a baby girl, Mary Queen of Scots. Thus, for the rest of the 16th century, Scotland remained weak with no strong monarch, and there were endless rivalries amongst the nobility. Had Flodden not happened, and Scotland continued under James IV's leadership, then history could have been very different. For Surrey and my family, Flodden was a great personal victory, and it far outshone the rather mediocre successes gained by Henry VIII and Wolsey in their French escapade. At last Surrey was suitably rewarded with the prize he had fought so hard for since Bosworth. At a magnificent ceremony at Lambeth Palace on Candlemas Day, 1514, he was honourably restored into his right name of Duke of Norfolk. He was also granted an honourable augmentation to our family coat of arms. Namely, and I quote, "In an escutcheon or a demi-lion rampant, pierced through the mouth with an arrow, within a double tressure flory and counter flory gules." In other words, the Scottish lion chopped in half with an arrow stuck down its throat. I think you will all now understand why I thought it sensible to bring my car here today. And so, due to various factors, not least of all luck, my family survived the late 15th and early 16th century, although even more turbulent times were to come. Thomas Howard, the Lord Admiral, succeeded his father to become the 3rd Duke of Norfolk, and remained in power for most of Henry VIII's reign, before succumbing to attainder at the very end. He escaped being beheaded only because Henry VIII died on the morning of his execution. His son, the poet Earl, was beheaded on a false charge of treason. The fourth Duke was beheaded by Elizabeth I for trying to marry Mary Queen of Scots. And his son, Philip, was imprisoned in the Tower for much of his life for refusing to give up the Catholic faith, for which he was later canonized as a saint. Right up until the mid-17th century, my family mirrored the life of the Earl of Surrey, experiencing riches and glory one moment, and then suffering tragedy the next. And through all of this period, it was the memory of Flodden which spurred us on to fight back after each disaster and survive. And so as we stand here today to commemorate the last medieval battle to be fought on English soil, our thoughts must lie with those brave men on both sides who died fighting for their country. Flodden was our victory, and Bannockburn, 200 years earlier, was most certainly yours. Thank goodness that medieval warfare is now a thing of the past, and the conflict between our two nations ended long ago. There is renewed talk at present about Scottish devolution, and I believe that as we move closer to European unity, some form of greater devolution for Scotland may well happen. We are not, after all, one nation. We are two nations who are part of one kingdom. But the conflict between us, which was such a large part of our history, right up until the 18th century, is a thing of the past. Of this I am certain. And the fact that you have asked the Earl of Surrey up today to remind you of your greatest defeat, and there hasn't yet been a riot, is proof indeed of the great friendship which exists between our two nations. I also have a personal interest in this, because I too have Scottish blood in me. My direct ancestor on my mother's side was Lord Herries, who fought at Flodden alongside James IV and died there with him.